In the previous video, we saw that acid chlorides can be prepared from carboxylic acids using thionyl chloride. And in this video, we'll examine the reactions of acid chlorides which follow the paradigm of nucleophilic acyl substitution. In nucleophilic acyl substitution, a good leaving group on a carbonyl is replaced by a nucleophile. The carbonyl bearing an R group can be called an acyl group, hence the name of the reaction. Be careful to note that although this is a substitution reaction, SN1 and SN2 reactions do not occur on sp2 hybridized centers. Therefore, this reaction must have a unique mechanism. The nucleophile may be negative or neutral, and the mechanism is nearly the same in either case, except that neutral nucleophiles will require one additional mechanistic step. So let's first examine the shorter mechanism, which occurs when a negatively charged nucleophile is used. The mechanism begins with nucleophilic attack on the electrophilic carbonyl carbon, and this displaces the carbonyl pi electrons onto oxygen as a lone pair. The intermediate thus formed is known as a tetrahedral intermediate, and the reason is the carbonyl carbon was originally sp2 hybridized, giving it trigonal planar or flat geometry. But upon addition of the nucleophile, this carbon becomes sp3 hybridized, giving it tetrahedral geometry. This tetrahedral intermediate is transient though. In other words, it collapses to reform the carbonyl pi bond. And as it does so, the best leaving group is displaced from the tetrahedral center. Chloride is an excellent leaving group, so it is the entity that gets displaced. Very little changes when the nucleophile is neutral. The initial nucleophilic attack still generates a tetrahedral intermediate. However, in this case, as the neutral nucleophile acquires a new bond, it also becomes positively charged. The leaving group dissociates as the carbonyl is reformed during the next step of the mechanism. And finally, one additional mechanistic step is required to show the loss of a proton from the nucleophilic component to generate a product without any formal charge. Acid chlorides are very reactive due to their excellent leaving group, chloride. As a result, they can undergo nucleophilic acyl substitution with a variety of nucleophiles. Let's take a look at a few. Acid chlorides can undergo reaction with carboxylates. Carboxylates are the conjugate bases of carboxylic acids. The reaction begins when the carboxylate attacks the carbonyl carbon of the acid chloride, thereby displacing the pi electrons onto oxygen to form a tetrahedral intermediate. This tetrahedral intermediate collapses to expel chloride, and as a result, an anhydride is formed. Acid chlorides can also undergo reaction with water. In this case, water is the nucleophile that initially attacks the carbonyl carbon of the acid chloride, again displacing the carbonyl pi electrons onto oxygen. The tetrahedral intermediate subsequently collapses to reform the carbonyl as chloride dissociates. And finally, a proton is lost as the final product, a carboxylic acid, is formed. On the previous slide, chloride was used as the base to remove the proton from the oxonium ion. However, you may sometimes also see another molecule of water being used as the base to serve that function. In this case, the byproducts are chloride and the hydronium ion rather than HCl, as we saw on the previous slide. The difference between these two options is not as significant as it may initially appear to be. When water is used as a reactant or reagent, it also often serves as the solvent for the reaction. And if hydrochloric acid is formed in water, Bronsted-Lowry acid-base reaction will yield chloride as well as the hydronium ion. What this means is that our byproducts are the same in either instance. When water served as the base to remove a proton from the oxonium ion in the last step of our mechanism, we made chloride and hydronium ion directly as byproducts. On the other hand, when chloride was used as the base to remove a proton from the oxonium ion in the last step of our mechanism, hydrochloric acid was the byproduct. However, as we now see, hydrochloric acid reacts with water to give us the exact same byproducts in either instance. Acid chlorides can also undergo reaction with alcohols, and this reaction is very similar to the reaction with water. It begins with the nucleophilic attack of the alcohol on the carbonyl carbon, thereby displacing the pi bonding electrons onto oxygen. The tetrahedral intermediate thus formed loses chloride in the process of restoring the carbonyl. And finally, a proton is lost. As we saw in the previous example, the proton may be lost to chloride or to another molecule of reagent. In either instance, our product of interest is an ester, and our byproducts will ultimately be chloride and an oxonium ion. This oxonium ion is the conjugate acid of the reagent. Finally, acid chlorides may also undergo reaction with amines. The amine serves as the nucleophile and first attacks the carbonyl carbon, pushing electrons onto oxygen so as to form a tetrahedral intermediate. The tetrahedral intermediate then collapses, expelling chloride as a leaving group. Finally, the reaction concludes with the loss of a proton so as to neutralize the charge on nitrogen, yielding an amide as the product of interest. Since amines are fairly basic, it is important to use two equivalents of the amine reagent in this reaction. One equivalent is incorporated into the amide, and the other reacts with the acid that is liberated during the reaction so as to form an ammonium salt as a byproduct. This second equivalent of amine is sometimes referred to as a sacrificial equivalent because it is not incorporated into the product and serves only to sequester the acid produced during the reaction. If the amine reagent is expensive, or difficult to prepare, an alternative option is to use a single equivalent of the amine along with one equivalent of pyridine. Pyridine functions as a non-nucleophilic base, and it reacts with the acid produced during the reaction. It therefore takes the place of the sacrificial equivalent of the amine. So in this variation, all of the amine reagent is incorporated into the amide product. At this point, it's useful to make a final note on mechanistic variations. Some texts will show the loss of proton and the dissociation of the leaving group in the reverse order, particularly when the conditions are more basic. The net result is the same, but the second and third mechanistic steps are reversed in this variation. In other words, the amine can attack the carbonyl carbon, forming a tetrahedral intermediate as the pi bonding electrons are pushed onto oxygen. The ammonium ion of that tetrahedral intermediate can then be deprotonated so as to neutralize it. And lastly, the tetrahedral intermediate can collapse so as to displace chloride. The product is still an amide, and the byproducts are the same. Again, it is merely that the second and third mechanistic steps have been reversed in this variation. In summary, acid chlorides react readily via nucleophilic acyl substitution. They can react with carboxylates to yield anhydrides. Reaction with water affords carboxylic acids, while the analogous reaction with alcohols provides esters instead. Reaction with amines produces amides. This reaction requires either two equivalents of the amine, one of which is sacrificial, or one equivalent of amine and one equivalent of pyridine to consume the acid produced during the reaction. The preceding was an excerpt from the book Introductory Organic Reaction Mechanisms, a color-coded approach to arrow pushing. If you found this video to be helpful, you may be interested in the complete book, which is available in ebook format from Scribd, in paperback from Amazon, or in paperback at a discounted price from Lulu.